In Hungary, the pattern was the same. The monarchy overthrown by a broad-based socialist government. Then the declaration of a Soviet republic. Its leader, Bela Kun, said, quoting Marx, "Every step of actual movement is more important than a dozen programs." The Hungarian Soviet lasted 6 months and was undermined by the invasion of Czech and Romanian forces who occupied Budapest. Workers' councils like this one were executed. Marx's predictions of proletarian revolution in the advanced capitalist countries had been proved right. The proletariat looked for a time as though it would become the leading class of the 20th century. Where the Marxist movements went wrong was in misjudging the resilience of capitalism and the strength of the state. It was a costly mistake, and as the tide of revolution in Europe began to ebb, it left the Russian Revolution isolated and exposed. The Soviet Union stood isolated. It was encircled by Tsarist troops, backed by the armies of 17 nations. These were the soldiers, workers and peasants who fought to hold back the combined forces of the capitalist countries in their crusade against what the British War Secretary, Winston Churchill, called the nameless beast of communism. For a time it seemed likely that the first Marxist revolution would be defeated, like the other revolutions in Europe. But in an amazingly short space of time, the Bolsheviks shaped a Red Army from an undisciplined, backward peasantry. Its organizer was the war commissar, Trotsky. This army took on a vastly superior force, and against all expectations, they won. The Soviet Revolution survived, but at appalling cost. Russia's backward and underdeveloped industry lay in ruins, devastated by the war. 9 million people had died in the war from famine, cold and disease. Now to the immense problems of this vast, semi-feudal, backward nation were added the burden of millions of refugees. There was also sabotage by opponents of the Bolsheviks, and even armed rebellion from among their supporters. Lenin faced these colossal problems by establishing, in his own words, strict iron discipline backed up by the state power of the armed workers, and Lenin's centralized Bolshevik party structure became the instrument of this discipline. He had set in motion the state machine that Stalin would inherit. Opposition was banned, and the secret police began the searches, arrests and executions. Rosa Luxemburg had written, "The remedy which Trotsky and Lenin have found, the elimination of democracy as such, is worse than the disease it is supposed to cure, for it stops up the very living source from which alone can come the correction of all the innate shortcomings of social institutions. That source is the active, untrammeled, energetic, political life of the broadest masses of the people." Her words were tragically borne out in the trials and executions of Mensheviks and social revolutionaries. Lenin's party of iron became increasingly centralized, bureaucratic and dictatorial. Worst of all, Red Terror failed to solve Russia's economic problems. Lenin was forced to relax the rigors of war communism and adopt a new economic policy of limited private enterprise. The new policy worked. The peasants provided food for the cities, and industrial production began again. The new socialist society began to tackle the aftermath of the war, to feed and clothe the millions of orphans, to provide free education and to raise the cultural level of the Russian population, to produce a new generation of human beings, tough, clean, disciplined, hard-working, to break the hold of religious superstition, and to construct a modern industrial society. In spite of everything, the Soviet Revolution did move forward. In spite of everything, there was a sense of optimism, of the novelty and boldness of the Soviet experiment. There was a sense of modernism, of new openings towards the future. People were becoming aware of themselves as agents in a process of revolutionary change. Lenin died in 1924. There was genuine popular grief. Almost at once, the construction of the Lenin myth began, part of which is that Lenin had no responsibility for the excesses that were to follow. Stalin was waiting in the wings. Already General Secretary under Lenin, Stalin was an ambitious careerist who had made his way up the party hierarchy. He took control of the funeral arrangements and mummified Lenin like a pharaoh. Lenin had built the Soviet party machine that Stalin was to control. Towards the end of his life, he had sensed the possible consequences. But Lenin's warnings were ignored. Throughout the 20s and 30s, Stalin consolidated his control. He began to build his own frozen version of socialism, a society of neat lives and optimistic souls, with no room for questioning or debate. Stalin was determined to drag Russia out of backwardness. Either we do it or they crush us, he claimed. He set about mechanizing and collectivizing the mass of peasants. His aim was to use agriculture to supply the surplus for rapid industrialization. And to achieve this, Stalin decided to eliminate the wealthier peasants as a class. About 5 million people were deported and 2 million died. For Stalin, this was only a beginning. He jailed or executed millions of people in the party, the army, and the bureaucracy. This was Stalin's contribution to the fulfillment of the Communist Manifesto. Stalin had done more to destroy the hope of socialism than all its enemies put together. And yet, at the price of terror, Stalin modernized the Soviet economy. And under Stalin, Marxism became the religion of Russia's national development. The foundations of modern industry were laid. He announced, "We are becoming a country of metal, a country of automobiles, a country of tractors." And following Lenin, he claimed, "The party plus electrification equals communism."
В настоящий момент мы даем 3500 в смену ламп. Это много. Но комсомолец ставит своей задачей догнать и перегнать Америку, дать смену 7000 ламп. Этого мы добьемся. Мы настолько овладели техникой, что выпустили свою техническую книгу под названием «Как делается электролампочка». Читайте ее. А работу бригады вы увидите сейчас.
The central planning of the Soviet economy spawned a massive bureaucracy. 6 million even under Lenin, now it had become a self-perpetuating elite. The bureaucracy was charged with producing the epic monuments to Stalin's era. At a time during the 1930s when the capitalist world was gripped by recession and the growth of fascism, the images of Soviet modernization, education and welfare appealed to many in the West as an attractive alternative. With his rich sense of humor, Stalin claimed, "Of all the treasures a state can possess, the human lives of its citizens are for us the most precious." Soviet citizens were required to express their unanimous consent for Stalin's rule through the ballot box. In the one-party state, who can guess which party Stalin voted for?